Every day, my father-in-law Richard appears in our yard. He comes at the same time, stands quietly, and just stares at us. Even if I greet him, he doesn't respond and silently walks away. This silent visit had been going on for 6 months. At first, I thought he was just stopping by while out for a walk. But as the days passed and his silent visits continued, I started to feel uneasy. It seemed like Richard wanted to tell us something, but the frustration of not being able to understand his intentions grew. That wasn't the only thing bothering me. I was also increasingly worried about my daughter, Sarah, who had seemed down lately. I was concerned something might have happened at school, so I consulted with her teacher, but they assured me nothing was wrong. As a mother, I wanted to know what was happening with Sarah, but she wouldn't talk to me. Then, my husband Kevin had to leave for a week-long business trip overseas. With the heavy atmosphere in the house, Kevin's absence only increased my anxiety. Whenever I tried to talk to Kevin about Sarah or Richard, he just brushed it off with a laugh.
Sarah's just at that age, and Dad, he's just shy.
On the day of Kevin's trip, I took him to the airport, my heart weighed down with worry. After Kevin left, Richard appeared in the yard as usual. Kevin's not coming back for a while since he's on that business trip. The moment I casually mentioned that, Richard's expression changed.
Well, actually, this house he is.
The moment Richard's words reached my ears, my heart froze. And the moment those words were burned into my brain, I was moving unconsciously. Before I knew it, I had run out of the house barefoot. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing grew shallow. I'm married, 45 years old. I work part-time while enjoying peaceful days with my husband, Kevin, and our daughter, Sarah. Sarah is about to start elementary school, and lately she's been asking for her own room. Seeing her making the biggest request she can in her small way, we made a decision. We realized we needed a bigger house to support Sarah's growth. So, a year ago, we decided to build a new house near Kevin's parents' place and start a new chapter in our lives. The house, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood, is the beginning of a fresh start for our family. Sarah is thrilled to have her own room, and every time we see how happy she is, we know building this house was the right choice. Kevin, who's always been a doting dad and loves photography, was especially enthusiastic when the new house was completed.
This way, I can take lots of pictures of Sarah being happy.
Kevin's eyes sparkled as he held his camera with a childlike innocence. Kevin had always loved photography, and since Sarah was born, his passion had only grown stronger. Before we moved, our apartment walls were covered with pictures of Sarah. Her first steps, her joyful face with birthday cake, moments from family outings. These photos were like treasures to Kevin, and they represented his way of witnessing our family's growth. Even after moving into our new house, his enthusiasm didn't fade. In fact, now that Sarah had her own room, he was even more eager to capture new sides of her. Watching Kevin follow Sarah's growth with his camera was a testament to his deep love for our family. Kevin had always been worried about his father, Richard, living alone. When we decided to build our new home, Kevin saw it as the perfect chance and was happy. With Richard living close by, Kevin felt reassured knowing he could be there quickly if needed. Now, Kevin often finds time to visit his father's place and help him out. Seeing how much Kevin values his bond with Richard often warms my heart. His dedication to supporting and protecting our family must also be leaving a positive impact on Sarah. And more than anything, I was filled with joy that we were able to build our home in this quiet suburban neighborhood. With Kevin's family nearby and plenty of green space, it's a perfect place for Sarah to grow up freely. Since moving here, I felt like our family has truly found happiness. One day, strange things started happening around me. At first, the changes were small, but gradually, the oddities became more noticeable. What stood out the most was that Richard began coming to our front yard. It's been 6 months since Richard started visiting. At first, I thought he was just stopping by during his walk, so I casually tried to chat with him. However, Richard never stepped into the yard, just stood there silently, not saying a word, and after a while, he would leave without uttering a single thing. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was part of his exercise routine. But seeing him appear at the same time every day, standing there in silence, started to worry me. I began to feel anxious, wondering if Richard was troubled by something or had something he wanted to tell us. Still, I continued to make an effort to talk to him every time he came. "Hello, Richard. It's a nice day today. How about some coffee?" I tried inviting him, but Richard never responded. These silent visits weighed heavier on my heart with each passing day. What made me even more uneasy was not just his silent comings and goings, but the subtle changes in his expressions during those visits. Sometimes his lips would move as if he wanted to say something, or he'd let out a deep sigh, and seeing this gradually filled me with a sense of urgency. As Richard's silent visits continued, my mind began to race with different possibilities. Could there be some serious issue within the family, or is there something wrong with Richard's health? These unanswered questions stirred my heart, and my worry grew with each passing day. There was another problem that troubled me. Sarah had recently lost her usual energy. She used to run around the house with such brightness, but lately she seemed down. Even when I talked to her, her responses were slow, as if she was hiding something. At first, I thought something might have happened at school, so I consulted with her teacher. However, the teacher just tilted her head, saying there didn't seem to be any issues. Sarah wasn't being bullied, nor did it seem like she had any trouble with her friends. Hearing this from the teacher gave me a little relief, but my worry didn't go away. When Sarah got home, I gently asked her, "Did something happen at school? Will you tell me, sweetie?" Even though I asked her softly, Sarah just stayed silent and looked away. That silence weighed heavily on my heart. The fact that Sarah wouldn't open up to me made me even more anxious. I had no way of knowing what was troubling her little body. A sense of helplessness washed over me as a mother, and I started blaming myself for not being able to do anything. All I could do was hope for the day when her bright smile would return. Worried, I talked to Kevin about Sarah. I told him as much as I could about how she had been lately and asked if he had any idea what might be going on. But Kevin just shrugged with a laugh and replied lightly.
It's just her age.
His words didn't feel serious, and I couldn't shake my knees. I also brought up Richard. I told him about how Richard came to the yard every day and left without saying a word, but Kevin just laughed as usual.
Dad's just shy.
He didn't seem to give it any thought and brushed it off in his usual manner. Lately, Kevin had been busy with work, leaving the house early in the morning and coming home late at night. We hardly saw each other, and even when I wanted to talk, the days just passed by in a blur. We used to go out together on weekends, but these days we don't. Even on his days off, Kevin seemed exhausted and spent most of his time relaxing at home. Watching him like that made me feel a sense of loneliness. One day, when another family outing didn't happen, I sighed, feeling the weight of how little time we were spending together as a family. Then, one day, Kevin suddenly told me he had to go on a business trip overseas for about a week. Although I was surprised by the sudden news, there was nothing I could do since it was for work. I was worried about both Sarah and Richard, but there was no way I could ask Kevin not to go on the trip because of that. On the day he left, I went to the station to see him off. I prayed that Kevin's work on the business trip would go well and hoped he would return safely. I watched him until he disappeared from view, then returned home alone. After a while, Richard appeared at the usual time. I still couldn't tell if he was there to say something or if he was just standing silently as always. Thinking, here we go again, I walked out to the yard to welcome Richard. As usual, Richard stood there quietly in the yard. Up until now, I hadn't known how to handle these silent visits, but today I felt like trying to start a conversation. Kevin's gone on a business trip overseas for a while, so why don't you come inside and relax today? I said casually. Suddenly, Richard's expression, which had been blank, changed dramatically. His face showed a mix of surprise and tension, and in a low voice, he began to speak.
You see, this house is being bugged.
For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what Richard was saying. But as the meaning of his words connected in my mind, a chilling fear gripped my entire body. I didn't want to believe the reality that the house was being bugged. However, the moment those words took on a sense of reality and etched themselves into my mind, I found myself moving unconsciously. Before I knew it, I had run out of the houses barefoot. I raced through the yard and fled beyond the property. My heart was pounding like crazy, and my breathing grew shallow. Fear and confusion overwhelmed me, and all I could think of was that I had to escape. Maybe my face looked pale, because Richard hurriedly put his arm around my shoulder and helped me out of the yard. The warmth of his arm calmed me down just a little, but inside, I was still overwhelmed with shock. Then Richard suddenly pulled a laptop out of his bag and showed me the screen. With fear, I stared at the screen, not knowing what would appear. Displayed on the laptop were pictures of Sarah. There was no mistaking it. In that instant, my heart shattered. One by one, pictures of Sarah with bruises on her back scrolled by. My body trembled at the unbelievable sight, and tears flowed uncontrollably from my eyes. Why is this happening to Sarah? My voice quivered, barely forming the words. Richard, looking regretful, lowered his eyes and spoke in a heavy tone.
The culprit is Kevin. You need to leave the house immediately.
My husband, Kevin? Doing something like this to our beloved Sarah? It can't be true. I couldn't suppress the disbelief, shaking my head in denial. I tried desperately to reject the thought in my mind, but the harsh reality in front of me crushed my hopes. Richard's face was etched with sadness and deep regret. He began to explain in a heavy voice what he knew.
Mary, when Kevin was coming over to my house, it wasn't to take care of me. He was messing with my computer.
Those words tightened the icy grip around my heart once more. Why would Kevin do something like that? I couldn't make sense of it, and my mind was spinning in confusion.
I never used the computer, so I didn't think much of it and left it as it was. I never imagined something like this would happen.
Richard's voice was filled with a mixture of regret and frustration. He explained that he had recently attended a computer class at the local community center and decided to try using his laptop again. He hadn't touched it in a long time, but finally powered it on after learning how to use it.
I was just trying out different things when I noticed some strange files.
Richard spoke in a grave tone. Could it really be that data?
That's right, it was photos of Sarah.
I gasped at Richard's words. I didn't want to believe that such a reality was staring me in the face.
I immediately confronted Kevin, asking why he did something like this.
But what Richard said next made me shiver even more.
I'm just keeping a record of her discipline.
Richard said that Kevin had stated it nonchalantly. My mind was in chaos. unable to grasp what was happening. I never imagined such cruel words could come from Kevin's mouth. Worse still, Richard said Kevin threatened him afterward.
Don't you dare tell Mary about this.
Richard's story became even more unbelievable.
I've planted multiple bugs in the house. If you tell Mary about this, I'll know right away, and if you do, I'll make Sarah suffer even more.
According to Richard, Kevin said all this with a smirk.
Why would he do something like that?
Richard, his voice trembling, asked Kevin, and Kevin reportedly laughed as he replied.
I think Sarah's reactions, her discomfort and voice are adorable. The bugs are like a keepsake, a memento. I love Sarah.
Hearing that Kevin had spoken those words with such confidence, I was speechless. It felt like I was staring at a completely different person, a cruel, cold version of the Kevin I thought I knew. This horrifying reality seemed to be swallowing me whole. Richard tried time and again to reason with Kevin. I'm sure his attempts were full of the love and responsibility only a father could have. In his own way, Richard was doing everything he could to protect Sarah's innocent smile. But Kevin apparently remained unfazed, brushing off Richard's words with a calm, indifferent attitude, as if he didn't even realize what he was doing was wrong. Then one day, when Richard was particularly persistent in his attempts to persuade him, it happened. Kevin smirked as if he were telling a joke and said with a grin,
So, Dad, are you willing to take her place?
The moment Richard heard those words, he must have been devastated. However, after a brief hesitation, he quietly spoke with what seemed like a newfound resolve.
If it's for Sarah, I'll take her place.
Those words of determination must have been filled with immense pain and love. For Richard, it seemed like the only way to protect Sarah. Kevin seemed momentarily stunned by Richard's unexpected response. His face likely showed a mix of surprise and confusion. However, the silence didn't last long. Kevin quickly regained his composure, narrowing his eyes as if calculating something. After a brief pause, he spoke again.
I see. In that case, instead of hurting Sarah, why don't I just take money from you?
Those words were so cold and heartless. Richard had never expected to hear something like that from someone who was supposed to protect his family. But even in such a terrible situation, Richard focused on what he could do for Sarah. For him, protecting Sarah was the highest priority. Hesitantly, Richard nodded. He began cutting back on his own living expenses to secretly give money to Kevin. The thought of Richard scrimping from his monthly income, quietly trying to protect Sarah, was heartbreaking. Richard's hands were once the same hands that had gently held Sarah. How much pain must Richard have felt, knowing that those same hands were now being used to hand over money to Kevin? Richard kept telling himself that if it meant saving Sarah, he had to do it, and he continued to meet Kevin's demands. However, as time passed, Richard began to realize that Kevin wasn't keeping his promise. Kevin pretended to have stopped his violence, but in reality, he continued his so-called discipline with Sarah. Every time new photos of Sarah appeared, the horrifying truth became clearer, and Richard's heart was torn apart. I'm sure Richard thought many times that this couldn't go on. But terrified by Kevin's threats, he was torn between fear and the need to protect Sarah, unsure of what to do. One day, unable to bear it any longer, Richard finally decided to confess everything to me. His eyes filled with tears and his voice trembled. Richard collapsed as if his strength had left him, apologizing to me through tears.
I tried to tell you so many times, but I just couldn't. I'm so sorry.
Seeing him like that brought an overwhelming surge of emotion in my heart as well. Richard had been desperately fighting to protect Sarah. I could feel the depth of his suffering, his helplessness, and the love he had for Sarah. Richard. I could barely get the words out. With Richard's tears, a firm resolve was born in my heart. After consulting with Richard, I made up my mind to act immediately. I couldn't just stay silent and let things continue. I felt deep inside that I had to do something right away to protect Sarah. That day, Richard and I went to her school to pick her up. Sarah looked surprised, but sensing the seriousness in our expressions, she got into the car without saying a word. We didn't return home. Instead, we headed straight to the Child Protective Services. In the quiet consultation room, Richard opened the laptop he had brought. The counselor looked at the photos on the screen, then gently spoke to Sarah.
Sarah, I'm so sorry for what you've been through, but you're safe now. Can you tell us what happened?
At first, Sarah was confused, but gradually she began to open up, and through her tears, she slowly revealed the pain she had been carrying. Through her tears, Sarah began to share the things she had been keeping hidden in her heart. At first, the incidents weren't that frequent, but after we built a new house, the memories of Kevin's discipline gradually increased. Before the move, Kevin had been kind, and there was little violence. But after moving into the new house, the frequency of Kevin's actions had steadily increased.
Dad kept saying it was all my fault.
Sarah's trembling voice reached my ears. My heart was torn apart by pain and anger. I felt an overwhelming guilt for not knowing and for failing to protect her. Sarah also revealed that much of the abuse happened when I wasn't home, especially on weekends when my job kept me busy. Learning that Sarah spent those hours in fear while I was away crushed me with an indescribable guilt.
Dad said that if I told Mom, he'd hurt Mom the same way, so I couldn't say anything.
The moment I heard that, tears poured from my eyes, unstoppable. I felt a crushing pain in my chest as I realized that both Sarah and Richard had been enduring such deep suffering because they were thinking of others. The thought that their efforts to protect others had led to this terrible situation filled me with an overwhelming sadness and anger that words could not express. However, the target of that anger was clear. The source of all this suffering was Kevin. The harm Kevin inflicted on Sarah is something that can never be forgiven. I swore deep in my heart, I will never forgive Kevin. A few days passed, and the day Kevin was set to return from his business trip finally arrived. With a mix of complicated emotions swirling inside me, I headed to the airport. It wasn't to welcome Kevin, but because I had steeled myself for what was about to happen. In the arrival lobby of the airport, I was waiting for Kevin alongside Richard. Richard was as silent as always, but I could see the determination in his eyes. We didn't exchange words, simply waited quietly. Soon, Kevin's flight arrived, and passengers began pouring into the lobby. When I spotted Kevin among them, I felt my heart waver for just a moment. When Kevin spotted us, he smiled and waved happily at first, making his way toward us. His face held the expression of someone excited to reunite with his family. But the moment Kevin noticed the police officer standing behind me and Richard, his smile vanished, and his face turned pale. He froze for a second before quickly turning on his heels and trying to run. However, his actions were quickly stopped by the police officers, who immediately restrained him and put him in handcuffs.
It's not what you think. You've got it all wrong. I didn't do anything.
Kevin, in a panic, started shouting, desperately trying to escape the situation.
It was just a moment of weakness. I never meant for it to end up like this.
His words became weaker and turned into pitiful excuses. As I watched him, my resolve grew even stronger. No matter how many excuses he makes, nothing can justify what he's done. For Sarah's sake, I silently vowed again. As I watched Kevin being pushed into the police car and saw it drive away, I let out a deep sigh. The divorce proceedings between Kevin and me moved swiftly after that, and naturally, I was granted full custody of Sarah. The bonds of our family were severed completely, and there would be no going back. As the legal process moved forward, I repeatedly asked myself if my decision was the right one, but I had to reaffirm that this was the only way to protect Sarah's future. During the police interrogation, I was informed that Kevin claimed his actions were a way to relieve stress. The moment I heard that, a surge of anger filled my chest. This was not something that could be excused as stress relief. No matter how much pressure or frustration Kevin might have been under at work, I questioned whether he truly understood how utterly unacceptable it was to direct that toward our young daughter, Sarah. I was told that Kevin cried and repeatedly apologized during the police questioning. But no matter how sincere those apologies might have been, they didn't move me anymore. Even if Kevin was beginning to realize the gravity of his actions, that wouldn't heal the deep wounds he had inflicted on Sarah. His apologies were far from enough to repair the damage done to her heart. It would take a long time for Sarah to heal from the emotional scars caused by her own father. Meanwhile, I decided that Sarah and I, along with Richard, would move to a new place. At one point, I considered starting a new life with just Sarah and me. However, I quickly changed my mind, realizing the significant role Richard played in saving Sarah from further harm during that terrifying time. I'm deeply aware that Sarah was spared further pain because Richard did everything in his power to protect her. Without him, Sarah might have been hurt even more deeply. Richard was not just a father-in-law. He was a shield for Sarah, and a figure who embodied the bonds of family. Sarah herself adored Richard and looked up to him as her hero. The way she gazed at him made it clear how much she relied on him. I strongly believe that Sarah feels safe starting this new life because Richard will be by her side. Without Richard, I might not have realized the horror of Kevin's actions, and Sarah could have been even more hurt. With that in mind, moving with Richard was an essential step for both Sarah and me as we began a new chapter. Richard also made a firm promise that he would never let such a mistake happen again. With a serious expression, Richard expressed his deep regret and spoke to me earnestly.
Even if Kevin tries something again, I will protect Sarah and Mary no matter what.
He said it as if he were making a vow to himself. Hearing those words filled me with a deep sense of relief. At the same time, I couldn't help but think about the weight of the pain and conflicts Richard had been carrying. Richard himself has also made difficult decisions to protect Sarah. Understanding that, we as a family were working to rebuild our trust and bond. We couldn't erase the past, but we chose to overcome it and move forward together. The three of us resolved to support one another and create a new, peaceful life. The road ahead might not be easy, but we were prepared to face the challenges with each other's help. With hope and courage, we made the decision to take our first step toward a new future as a family. To overcome the pain of the past, we would support each other and walk this path together. I believe that the future was something we would carve out with our own hands.